This is my four-wheel drive V8 swapped 1973 Toyota Hilux. So what's it take to build a truck like this? You bought yourself a 1970s Toyota mini truck. You got a ton of plans for it. You want this thing to be like no other truck you've ever seen before. Powerful, capable, most importantly, stylish. You realize you need 3 different vehicles, each for a specific reason. You want an insanely reliable engine. You go with the Tundra 2UZ. You choose a 4Runner for its rugged off-road capability, and finally, you have the Hilux for its looks. Now, you need to combine all 3 to create the ultimate Toyota mini truck.
That's a 2001 Toyota 4Runner, and I'm about to rip it down to a bare chassis to start on one of the biggest builds I have ever undertaken. This 4Runner is destroyed, it's missing a ton of parts, there is no engine, there is no transmission, the front end is gone. So it's really not good for much, but all I really want from this thing is the chassis. We're gonna tear this thing completely apart, take the body off of the frame, and this chassis is going to have much, much bigger and better things ahead.
Not having a 2-post lift and also having very low ceilings in my garage, I knew I was going to have to pull this outside. I also wanted to make sure I could get it as light as possible because not having any heavy machinery, I was going to be pulling this with my engine hoist, and any additional weight that was unnecessary was going to make it exponentially harder to move in my gravel driveway.
We got the frame completely pulled out from the 4Runner, and we got some pretty big plans with this thing. So that brings us to our parts Hilux. This was a Toyota Chinook that has had the camper removed, has no back on it. I need a vehicle to mock up on there so that we can get some body mounts made and get rolling in the right direction. We're gonna be stripping this thing down completely. I wanna take the hood, the fenders, the doors off, the front bumper, the front valence, and have nothing but the bare body left. I'm not too worried that the back doesn't have anything there, because all we're really using this thing for is the body mounts to get it mocked up onto the 4Runner chassis.
I went in with the exact same mentality as I did with the 4Runner. My goal is to make this as light as possible and as easy to manage when we're up in the air and removing it off of the chassis.
All of the body panels that are removable off, I've got the steering column disconnected from the steering box, the shifter disconnected from the transmission, pulled the radiator out, I got the brakes all disconnected and the lines pulled in. I've got pretty much everything I could see that was going between the body and the frame disconnected, as well as all 6 body mounts. So we got all 6 body mount bolts here, all the hardware, miscellaneous. Also, this only took a 10, a 12, a 14, a flathead, and a pair of pliers. That's the entire lineup of tools I've used thus far. So simple, so simple. We've got the doors sitting over there, we've got all the other body panels and all the other random parts sitting over here, and we're about ready to pick this thing up and get it off of the chassis. Getting this off the chassis is probably going to be a little bit of a pain. I'm going to go in between maybe an engine hoist and just lifting it by hand. I'm not exactly sure where the balance point is. The balance point is probably really far forward. I'm assuming probably like here-ish. So I don't know exactly how I'm going to pick it up with the engine hoist. I might try and just shimmy it off by hand. I guess there's not much to it but to do it.
I decided I would just take a strap between the door hinge bolts, and that actually worked out a lot better than I initially expected it to.
Time to get this chassis out of here. Whoa!
I was extremely excited to get the old chassis out and begin rolling the new chassis in. I was about to see if what I was thinking in my head was going to come to reality or if this was going to be an absolute and total waste of time.
Swapped out the floating mounts that don't really have a ton of support that were in the center of the 4Runner chassis for the rear mounts by the rear tires that are actual solid body mounts. Hopefully that'll help. It looked like they might line up, which would be absolutely ludicrous.
Unfortunately, I was unlucky enough that the body mounts from the 2001 Toyota 4Runner didn't line up from the 1973 cab.
Oh my God, that's crazy. Or body mounts definitely don't work, but that's okay. I can go ahead, pick this thing back up, chop these body mounts off of the chassis, and see what it looks like from there. That's what I'm going to start with. Because they would line up, but this front axle would not be even close to centered. Oh yeah, that's so much better already.
about where I'm gonna need to be. Maybe a hair forward, but that's pretty darn close. Gonna need to chop a bit off of the front of the frame. Oh man, this is exciting. This is gonna be so much work.
We got this thing set on the four-wheel drive chassis. Oh boy, am I fired up about this project. It looks so good. So currently it is sitting actually about 1.5 inches or so too far back. I am gonna be stretching the wheelbase of the Hilux about 2 inches. So that 2 inches there is gonna have to come from somewhere. So I'm gonna try and get 1 inch in the front, 1 inch in the back, and get it somewhat even on the chassis. But I don't know for sure that that's gonna happen. I'm just gonna try and do things the best and what makes the most sense. I wouldn't mind pushing this front forward more than I push the rear backwards. And mainly that's because I don't wanna have to cut into all of this. I would rather cut the front where there's not much going on than cut the back where we've got pinch weld and the floor of the Hilux itself. I think this thing is starting to turn out pretty good. I'm going to start fitting the cab up a little bit better. You can see this little cutout here was for the factory frame. I'm gonna extend that out another couple inches to like right here or so, get all that cut out so we can set it down that final little bit. I'm gonna do that on both sides. We're gonna pick the cab back up and cut the factory 4-runner body mounts off. I was hoping they might line up a little bit, but they didn't in any way, shape, or form. So I'm gonna cut those off flush, clean everything up on the frame, and get this thing ready to start mocking up body mounts for the Hilux. I do plan on keeping the independent front suspension and stock rear suspension setup. We've got coils in the rear, linked rear. It rides real good. It's got a ton of possibilities for articulation, and the front IFS is all factory components right now. We're gonna be able to use factory upper and lower control arms, factory style springs and shocks. They make bolt-on lift kits for the front and rear of this thing that are cheap, easy to install, and if I have all the factory chassis components, finding parts for this thing on the road will be easy. And we're talking about possibly taking this thing on some really dope, really long road trips. So I wanna make this thing reliable, factory, and just easy to upkeep, maintain, and comfortable on the road. And you just really can't beat independent suspension on road.
First things first, we got to get this cab lifted off the frame so we can start cleaning up these body mounts. We have no need for these mounts, and we want to keep this frame rail looking pretty decent, and just overall the build quality will be better if we remove all of the bracketry from the frame that we don't need. It is a little bit tedious to make sure you're not cutting too far into the frame rail and that you're making sure you don't scar anything up with the grinder. After I get the frame cleaned up, I go ahead and start clearancing the cab where everything was interfering so we have nothing in the way of mounting it.
We've got the body mounts taken off of the center of the chassis, and we have some clearance cut on both sides so this frame rail has just enough room to sit in there. We should have about a 1/2 inch on either side, and I went ahead and clearanced interior on both of them as well, so this should be good to go. I'm hoping that now we can set it down, get an idea of where it's going to go, and then start clearancing for the shock towers. The shock towers hit the interior of these fender liners, and that's just not going to work. But we're getting closer. Now that we've got those cleaned up and out of the way, when we get this back down and get everything clearanced, get the front end sitting as low as it needs to sit, we can start mocking up body mounts. I'm not exactly positive what I'm going to do for body mounts, but we're going to need body mounts. So I'm going to get this set in place, get the tire centered in the wheel well, get everything looking decent, and then after that we'll go ahead and start mocking up. I will probably start with these front body mounts on the body, just so that that's the center of the body, move to the rear, and then after that's all said and done, we're going to end up chopping the front of the frame probably about here or so because of how short the nose of the Hilux is, and we can then start assessing what we're going to do for front body mounts. Everything is going to be custom, this frame is going to be super modified, but it's going to have stock suspension geometry, and that's really the reason I used an entire chassis instead of just trying to four-wheel drive swap the chassis that is under the Hilux.
At this point, with the frame cleaned up, we could get the Hilux down and in place about where it needed to be. But We still wanted to get this thing as low as possible on the frame to keep our center of gravity as low as we can. So we take a Sawzall and clearance the inner fender wells to make that happen.
I've been debating for quite a while what I was going to do for motor mounts, and I think I figured I was just going to use as many factory components as possible. So as you saw, we cut the motor mounts off of the chassis, and that left us with these, the factory motor mounts from the 4Runner. So I figured I might as well just clean these up, which I did, and get them ready to weld back onto the chassis. We're actually going to need to extend them just a little bit out from the chassis in order to get these to line up with everything on the Hilux. I already got the chassis cleaned up as well where they're gonna go. Now I just need to cut out a few strips of metal, I think 1.5 inch strips, and that'll give us enough overlap to overlap onto the motor mounts that are there, and then we'll also be able to weld that straight to the chassis, and then I'll get everything mocked up, get those 2 rear ones mocked up, and then for the fronts, I'm not exactly sure what I'm gonna do yet. I do wanna use the factory motor mounts that were on the 4Runner, just because I can order these fairly easily, they're easily replaceable, and I've got them on hand. And if I do that, I can just make some brackets that this motor mount actually bolts to, because as you can see in this factory bracket, it's just a bolt-in application. For the core support motor mounts, that's gonna be a whole nother game. We've got about, what I measured is 9 inches of frame we're gonna be cutting off the front of this thing in order to get it tucked away behind where the front bumper goes. I'm gonna wait to do those motor mounts till after we've figured out where we're cutting the frame and what we're gonna do about cutting the frame. And after I've got 4 motor mounts on the cab, this thing is gonna be pretty well mounted, and we can start working on engine mounts. The engine we've got planned for this thing is pretty dang exciting too.
Yes, I was also cringing at how many times I said motor mount instead of body mount. I started by bolting the body mounts to the cab, then I measured everything and made sure it was perfectly centered before then adding the extensions and welding these body mounts to the frame.
We're working on these front body mounts. We got the rears done yesterday, well tacked in place I should say. Right now there's some 3/4 inch spacers holding the body off of the frame. I went ahead and I made 2 plates just like this. This plate is gonna go from the body mount straight over to the frame, and then that'll be the base of our front body mounts. After we get both of those top plates done, we'll start figuring out some gusseting and some triangulation to get everything held in place, get a couple holes drilled in it to hold the body mount, and then that should be that. We'll be able to get the engine hoist off of this thing and see what this thing looks like actually bolted to the chassis. 3.5 by 3.5 little 90° 45 gussets. We're about to see what this thing looks like on its body mounts for the first time ever. I might even take this strap off, put a couple more bolts in each of these fenders, and see how that looks. Look at that. This thing is sitting on body mounts on a 4-wheel drive chassis for the first time ever. We're making a 4-wheel drive Hilux. Oh, let's get the strap out of here. Oh my God, this is exciting. I'm probably gonna have to trim the front of this to clear everything when we're all said and done. But that's good, because I'd rather clear the front than the rear.
Next, I needed to assess how I was going to tackle these front body mounts. As it sat, the frame was way too far forward and the front valence was never going to fit. We were going to have to trim these frame rails back about 9 inches. Even then, we were still quite a ways from the body mounts, but we got to chopping, got things clearanced out, and finally got a plan of attack for body mounts.
So what I did is I cut out a couple plates that just have a 1.1/8 hole in them that this sits nice and flat on. And this is the 2 halves of the motor mount I'm going to be using. I'm gonna go ahead and bolt this up to the cab of the Hilux. And since it is too tall to actually be able to reach the frame, I've got these plates that I'm going to extend up to catch everything. And then after I get that on there, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna gusset everything so that they're nice and strong. This is all 3/16 plate, which should be more than enough to hold the body mounts on this thing. Got lots and lots to do on this thing, and I'm trying to get it done in a reasonable amount of time, so I better get back to work so we can get this thing driving sooner than later. Went ahead and we got these body mounts mocked up. They're just welded in the frame, gusseted out. Everything looks nice and solid. I did the same thing on both sides. We've got 45s front and rear. It's gonna be more than stout enough to hold the front of this thing. And I'm gonna wait to weld everything out till we've got the body off of the chassis again. I'm gonna have a ton of finish welding to do then. But for now, I'm gonna end up pushing this thing outside so we can start getting our drivetrain pulled in and pulled out of the donor vehicle. Right now, we've got a giant empty engine bay, and that's about to change. So let me go grab the truck that we're gonna be using for this swap. Here's our donor rig. This absolutely destroyed and disgusting Toyota Tundra with the legendary, unkillable 2UZ 4.7 liter V8. This is the power plant that's going in the Hilux, and we got a lot of work ahead of ourselves. So I went ahead and I dropped the battery in this thing. It's very sketchily set up, but I think it should be able to start. We're gonna get this thing pulled into the garage. It fires right up and has an astoundingly low 176, almost 177,000 miles. And not only does she fire right up, but she drives. So let's get this thing pulled into the garage for its last drive ever before this thing turns into the ultimate Toyota Hilux. All right, time to turn this thing into a Toyota Hilux. I think this thing is going to be absolutely awesome when it's finished, and that's all I really care about right now. And it's time to start tearing this thing down. I'm going to be being very cautious when pulling this thing apart. I want to save as many components as possible, so when we transfer it to the Hilux, everything is plug and play and easy to put back together.
Although not extremely difficult to remove, this transmission was very heavy and very large, which did necessitate me dropping it down in order to easily remove the wiring harness before finally pulling the transmission out from under the Tundra.
We finally got the transmission out, and of course, it's starting to pour rain outside. And I say of course because the Hilux that has a bunch of fresh metal all over it with body mounts and everything is sitting under a tarp right now because I went out and tarped it up. But we are ready to pull the engine. We can get this engine out of this bay. Once the engine's out of the Tundra, we can roll this Tundra out, sweep up a little bit, get this place cleaned up just a hair, and push the Hilux in so it's not sitting in the rain. We're gonna go ahead and hop on getting this engine out as soon as possible. That way we can get this thing out of the freaking garage.
Luckily at this point, I had already done all of the hard work. All we had to do was hook up and get it out of there. It was already disconnected from the motor mounts, the transmission, and all of the plumbing. Although the hood is a little bit of a pain to get around, once we got that sorted, we could get it out and push the Hilux in to assess the damage.
Definitely got a little bit of water in this thing, but for the most part, all the metal work I did is dry, and the engine bay is dry. You know, since we got this thing sitting here, we got this engine sitting here, I gotta just set it in the bay and see what it looks like. I can't help it. It's so exciting. About to see how absolutely massive of an undertaking this is gonna be. This is gonna be a tight fit. Oh gosh. We're touching the core support and the firewall right now. Oh, knew it was going to be a tight fit. Gosh dang. I might have to put the body onto the engine.
When I say put the body on the engine, what I'm referring to is installing the engine on a bare chassis and it being easier to put the body onto the already installed engine than to remove the engine from the already installed body, because it is that tight of a fit with this engine.
We're getting somewhere. The hood's gonna close, yes! Woo! I got a 2UZ swap for Hilux! So this steering might be a little more difficult than I anticipated. Like, that steering shaft goes straight into the header. That's gonna be an interesting one to figure out. For now, I'm gonna pull this engine out, get the front differential in, and start worrying about motor mounts, and steering will be a secondary thought for now. It does need steering. That is not debatable, but for now, I'm more worried about getting this engine in place with everything else that I need to make this thing four-wheel drive, and worrying about steering as a secondary thought, which is probably the wrong way to do it, but that's what I'm doing. Got the front differential in here, so now this should be everything that needs to go under the engine. I can put the engine back in the bay and start thinking about how we're gonna mount this thing. I also went ahead and threw the steering shaft in there. That is the stock 4Runner steering shaft. The reason I did that is because it's got this nifty little thing that now shoots the steering shaft at the proper angle to actually put a steering wheel in here without being at horrendous angles for the steering, because the steering shaft off of the rack and pinion is almost straight up and down, and steering wheels are not almost straight up and down. They're a lot closer to horizontal. So now comes the fun part of putting this thing back in the bay and hoping beyond hope that I can get motor mounts in with the front diff and the steering. Whew, we're stuffing 10 pounds of stuff in a 5-pound sack, that's for sure. We've got the engine in the bay. It's not mounted yet, but it is bolted to a transmission. And holy cow, is this combo so big for this truck. You can see that we are practically touching the steering shaft with the header down there. We're all but touching the firewall in the back. We are very close to the front diff and the subframe up front. Everything is just so tight, and we will be lucky to get a radiator in here. I'm probably gonna end up cutting this core support out, figuring something out with the hood latch. I don't know exactly what's gonna happen. Now we need to start figuring out how we're gonna get this thing mounted. I gotta get motor mounts and transmission mounts on this thing. It's gonna be a task, especially getting them tacked up or welded up in there without having everything out. So I'm probably gonna spend the next rest of the day trying to get these motor mounts solved and get the transmission mount started. I went ahead and made up a couple plates that will bolt to the factory rubber motor mounts that are attached to the frame. These are the factory Tundra motor mounts, in fact, and they bolt straight up to the 4Runner frame. And then I've got plates already bolted to the motor itself up in there, as you can see. And these plates will be sitting on the motor mounts, just like that. And I've got some cardboard here for some cardboard aided design. We're gonna go ahead and make some cardboard cutout templates that we can then turn into metal templates, weld in place, and hopefully everything is good. We can tack them up solid enough to hold this motor in place. Once the motor mounts are tacked up and held in place, I can go ahead, jump under there, and we can start doing transmission mount things. I'm not exactly sure what I can do for a transmission mount yet. I'm just kind of winging this stuff, figuring it out as I go. I made a cardboard template for the front and back of both side motor mounts, which allowed me to easily transfer it to plate steel and make brackets. That way we could tack them in place and everything would hold itself together until we could get everything fully mounted, the engine removed, and gusseting welded in. Unfortunately, as I finished up these motor mounts, I did realize I had other projects to wrap up, so I was going to need to take about a week and a half off of working on the Hilux. Luckily, we at least get to see what this thing looks like with the V8 in the engine bay under its own weight.